Good day, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Just Fish Outdoors. I'm your host, Dale York, and I designed Just Fish Outdoors to focus on freshwater lakes and streams and to provide information, tips, and techniques, along with how-to segments for catching everything from crappie to catfish. We will also provide tips on equipment, tackle, boating, and much, much more. All of this is aimed at helping you catch more fish and have fun doing it. So join us each week as we talk about my favorite subject, fishing. And that brings us to our special segment. For the special segment this week, I've asked my brother Brian, who is the expert on this particular topic in the family. I don't proclaim to be an expert in this particular topic by any stretch of imagination. And I've asked him to come along and share some of his knowledge and insight on this particular subject. Many folks start thinking about catfish. As the catfish begin to move upstream, they will follow the so-called underwater highways like the humps, the bridges, the drop-offs, anything like this, ledges, and that's what they'll travel on, going from their deep water haunts up to their shallow flats. They'll first move up close to the shallow water that's most adjacent to deep water. The ledges and the tributary mouths are another plus. In our reservoirs, they begin to move and feed in the warmest parts of the lake, as the warmer water will draw the shad, and of course this in turn will draw the catfish. Look for the sunny, shallow banks with structure. Wood's a plus this time of year. Mid-lake humps or flats, feeder creeks, and real sunny mud flats are exceptional this time of year. With the spring rains, it'll wash food like crayfish and worms into the lake. And the catfish will be up in the ends of those tributaries, especially after a hard rain, because they're all about catching an easy meal. What else comes to mind, Brian, this time of year, early spring?
You get in the back end of the creeks, back end of the pockets off of Main Lake. I've had reports this week of fish being caught on limb lines up in the back end of the pockets and creeks. You got one report of a couple of 20-pound plus flatheads caught up in the back end of a pocket up on Oologah this week on limb line. All these fish will move up to feed before it's spawn time. These fish, they were caught this week up on Oologah, they were flatheads. So, those fish, they won't spawn till probably June, late this month, early next month. Those fish, they were up there for one reason, and that was up there to feed. Like Dale said, this time of year, you want to find the warmest water you can find if you're going to fish shallow for the fish, and that'll be your most productive area.
Okay, that's pretty much the thing that's going to happen with these fish. As the next month rolls around, these fish will get shallower and shallower and shallower as a general rule. Now, the main lakes will become hotter and hotter and hotter as far as finding concentrations of fish. And, it's just going to be a matter of getting out there and finding the right combination as far as areas close to deep water. We'll talk about the tackle. I mean, let's talk about a rod and reel first. For most situations, I prefer when I'm after these things is a 7 foot, 6.5, 7 foot, fairly stout stick. I like a bait caster, but you don't have to throw a bait caster. You can throw a spinning reel. I like to spool my reel with 30, 40-pound braid and then use a monofilament leader, especially if I'm using a Carolina-type rig where I'm using a heavier sinker. What's your favorite rig, Brian?
Depends on where I'm at. If I'm in the river, I'll use the typical bank sinker rig with the sinker on the bottom and the hook tied on a dropper loop 12, 16 inches above the sinker. If I'm in the lake, sometimes I'll use the same rig in the lake, especially if I'm fishing off a bank and having to throw a long distance. That sinker on the bottom will help you maintain, get real good distance.
As far as rod and reel, what do you like?
if I'm in the lake, I use a lot of big spinning outfits. This allows you to get the most distance on your cast, easier, pretty easy operation, especially with large line. I'll run 20, 25 pound line, monofilament off of 8 and 10 foot rods.
Yeah, that's where we differ a little bit. He prefers the monofilament, and he prefers the spinning rod. I really don't have a so-called catfish rig. What I do is I back up and adjust one of my other rods for catfishing, and that's what I normally do. Is I throw braided line. I'll throw a 20, 30, 40 pound leader on there. The catfish's mouth is it's so abrasive. It's like they have a million little bitty teeth in there. And don't go with too light monofilament. If you go with too light monofilament and they get that hook in fairly deep, just the way they twist and shake their head, they can cut you off pretty easy. So keep that in mind. Once again, either type of reel works. Bait caster or spinning reel, either one. Spool your line with your preference, monofilament or braid. Either one will work great. Catfish are not line shy, so you don't have to worry about the braid as opposed to other species that may be a little more line shy. And a lot of times you're either fishing a little dingier water, especially in our tailwaters. So don't be afraid to try braided line. It is an excellent thing to use. Some times when you're fishing for the smaller catfish or the table size catfish, what I call pound, 2-3 pound catfish, the braided line, the bites can be very light. So the braided line will help you through that, and once again, like I said, they're not line shy, so, or at least I've never noticed them being too line shy.
No, they don't. Sometimes I think you could put that hook on a piece of ski rope and it wouldn't matter.
Yeah, I think you're right. They of course, they feed, or at least most of the catfish feed primarily by smell, not by sight anyway. So, one of the things you got to take in consideration when you're spooling up your line is whether you're fishing a tailwater situation or you're fishing a still water like a reservoir, because if you start getting too big in diameter of your line, what will happen, especially if you're fishing in a tailwater situation, the larger diameter of the line, the more drag you'll have on that line, the more weight you'll have to use to keep your bait down there if you're fishing on bottom, and it can actually cause you to miss a fish. You don't want to use any heavier line than you absolutely have to. For a lot of, if you're fishing up in the lake and you're fishing a very large diameter line, the wind can catch it and produce a pretty good sized bow in your line, and that can cause you to miss a fish as well, just because you can't get tight with the fish before you jerk. So take that in considerations when you're doing that, and if you're targeting big catfish, then you kind of have to adjust your rig in accordance with that. If you're targeting smaller catfish, say 10 pounds and under, you can get by with a lot less beefier equipment than you can if you're targeting big cats. The next thing we'll talk about is, what type of rig to use. Brian talked about, using a typical bait sinker with a dropper up above it. That's one way, especially if you're fishing a real trashy bottom. What you can actually do is that will keep your hook up off the bottom just a little bit with your sinker down on, so you're not as apt to get snagged in some situations, especially in some of your tailwater situations down below your dams. This can be a very effective rig to use. The next one would be the Carolina rig. Brian and I both use a Carolina rig, especially in the lakes, and it has its advantages and has its disadvantages. But what other kind of rigs come to mind, Brian?
Well, you can take that Carolina rig and do a modification to it. It's called a Carolina float rig. What this basically involves is your basic Carolina rig, except off the end of your other end of your swivel where your leader is at, where your hook goes. You make that leader a little bit longer, take a small float, put it halfway between your swivel and your hook, and that will actually float your bait up off of the bottom. That's a very popular method to use, especially in timber. It's real popular to use in areas that have a lot of weed growth in the bottom of lakes. They use that rig a lot back east of the Mississippi River, over in the Carolinas and stuff. They use that rig a lot over there. Then there's the float rig, which is basically your basic slip float hook sinker, where you can adjust the depths to it. It's a real popular rig on our reservoirs in springtime when these fish move up on these riprap banks to spawn. A lot of people get around these bridges and overpasses that go across our lakes, and they fish those riprap areas. And that float rig is a very, very popular method of catfish fishing those type areas, because you can get that bait just above the bottom off that riprap, and you don't have to worry about hardly ever getting hung up that way.
Yeah, we're getting very close to where these catfish are really starting to actively feed before they go on the beds, and they're roaming a lot, they're traveling a lot. And that floating rig that Brian was just discussing, in some cases, well, in many cases, it can be the preferred method of choice for catching, majority of your catfish, say under 5, 6, 7 pounds. It can produce a lot of fish, especially if you get into an area where they're actively roaming and feeding. One of the things we'll talk about as well is the type of hook. Now, on a Carolina rig, a lot of people use circle hooks, and I'm a proponent of circle hooks, because in a lot of cases it has a tendency to hook the fish in the corner of their mouth. And one of the things that's real popular nowadays, especially catching bigger catfish, is to snap a picture and release the fish. And circle hooks on a Carolina rig work real well. Now, it's really not our choice when we're fishing a floating rig or something that's up off the bottom that we're traveling with, simply because you may be fishing around rocks, you may be fishing around structure, you may be fishing around something with that float rig that you don't want that catfish to get into once they start biting. On a circle hook, the fish generally sets the hook themselves. You don't jerk the rod. The fish just takes off with the bait, and you just basically start reeling the fish in. Now, on a float rig, you don't necessarily want to do that. You may be fishing just a few feet away from the biggest, gnarliest, spider web of a tree that there is in the lake, and when that catfish hits that bait on your cork, you don't want that catfish to run with it. You want to snap that catfish's nose and bring him to the boat. You don't want him to get in that brush pile and get you all tangled up. So, on a float rig, we generally stress that probably just a regular strong J hook, regular type hook is ideal for a float rig, because you will be setting the hook, and you want to turn that fish before they get around whatever it is that you're fishing around. What else comes to mind, Brian?
Well, there's another style of hook that I really like for fishing. If you need to bust the fish immediately, on a good bite or whatever, and that's a Kale hook, called a Kale style hook, and I use those. Probably 80% of my catfish fishing is done with Kale hooks. I'll use anywhere from a 1/0 all the way up to a 4/0, depending on what particular species or size that I'm fishing for. This is a very, very strong hook. Fish are not prone to swallow it. I've caught fish up to over 50 pounds on rod and reel with this hook. And as a general rule, this hook will usually stick a fish either in the top, it will stick the fish in the mouth. They won't have a chance to get it down. Like Dale said, when you're fishing around cover, be it in a river, in a lake, or whatever, you're probably going to have to get that bait fairly close to that cover in order to entice that fish to bite, especially during the daytime. Now, of a night, that may be a different story. That fish will come out of there and he'll roam around a little bit to feed. He may come 20, 30 feet out away from that cover to take that bait, but during the day, he's going to be holed up underneath it, and you're going to have to get it fairly close to him in order to get him to bite it. So that means you're already kind of in the hole here when he bites it. That means you got to be on your toes and be ready to rock and roll, because, and this is where your heavier tackle comes in. You got to have enough rod and line there to move that fish away from that once you do stick him.
Yeah, and another thing we probably ought to throw in here is when you are deciding on how much weight to use on your Carolina rig,
or your bank sinker rig, only use enough that you have to have. Don't overweight your line or overweight that you don't need to. In a lot of cases, how you position your boat and how steady your boat is can determine to some extent how much weight you use. There's also wind to take in consideration. There's current if you're fishing below one of our dams. There's depth. There's a lot of things to consider when you're trying to select the amount of weight that you want, size of bait. There's just a myriad of things. But the point that I want to stress is don't use more than you have to use. Only use what you have to do the job. You can actually make a problem for yourself if you overweight your bait. It's just not a good thing to do ever. So don't do that. Another thing we'll talk about here briefly is we've talked about how to cover water with a floating rig, and we've talked about fishing on bottom with the Carolina rig and the bait sinker. Another real popular thing to do this time of year and throughout the summertime is they call it dragging for cats or cat dragging or whatever you want to call it, cat throwing, whatever you want to call it, is you rig a Carolina rig or one of these bait sinker rigs like Brian's talking about, and you get out there on these flats and you actually drift your boat with the wind or your trolling motor and drag that bait along the bottom, finding these scattered fish. It's an extremely productive method, especially in the summertime, and it's also a good way to get the rod jerk plumb out of your hand. So you have to be careful about that as well. Some tips on cat dragging, Brian?
The slower you can do it with the less weight you can do it, the better off you are. If at all possible, I like to keep my weight to like a half ounce or maybe a 3/4. Move just fast enough to where maybe every once in a while you have to lip up on the rod tip, to kind of get that bait, keep it moving. But you want to drift just fast enough to keep it moving. And if you can do that, you cover a lot of water. And like Dale said, when those, you wouldn't think it, but when a lot of times those big channel cats, when they hit a bait, when you're drift fishing like that, it's something akin to a lawnmower hitting a brick. It will come to a screeching halt and try to go the other way on you at a high rate of speed.
Yeah.
Tendency is a lot of times it's to set as soon as those fish hit like that. Folks, if you'll give it just a couple of seconds, if you'll spin around and follow that fish back with your rod, because once they hit it like that, they ain't going to drop it. And if you'll follow him back just a little bit, give him time to turn his body kind of sideways to you a little bit to where you're actually jerking back into the fish, you'll miss fewer and fewer fish if you give them time to get turned around to where you're putting the hook back into the fish.
And one of the other things we'll discuss here briefly is the type of bait. As for my money and what I've seen, you're going to be hard pressed to beat fresh shad. If you can go to your reservoir or your river and catch fresh shad, whether you cut them up, whether you use them live, whether you use them whole, whatever you do, in my humble opinion, and once again, I'm not catfish king by any stretch of imagination, but it is just hard to beat fresh shad. What's your bait of choice, Brian?
Oh, by far. As far as I'm concerned, there's certain times of the year, if you can't get shad, you just might as well stay home. And as the summer progresses and we get later on in the summertime, there's lots of other baits that will catch eating-sized fish. But in the spring like this, when the shad start moving up, of course, everything else is moving up along with them. It is very, very difficult to beat that fresh shad. And like Dale said, you can either cut it, fish it whole, fish it live, however it is you decide to do it. It is very difficult to beat that live or fresh gizzard shad.
There's a whole list of prepared baits out there that, and I'm sure most every one of them, if not all of them, will produce fish. But it's kind of hard to beat catching your own shad and learning how to throw a throw net, learning how to find those schools of fish with your electronics, the schools of bait fish, and finding the habits of those shad and learning where to catch them, it will just dramatically increase your chances of catching fish for dinner, I guarantee you.
Oh, definitely.
Folks, the thing we're trying to stress here, too, as well is, catfish fishing, you don't need a lot of equipment. You can literally just walk up and shore fish. Many of our reservoirs are just filled with these things, and it's not too much of a problem to get a bite if you're using the right type of bait and fishing some of the right type of water at the right time of year. It's great for family activity. Like I said, you don't need a lot of equipment. You can literally just load everyone up in the vehicle and drive up to the lake and fish off the bank. And in many cases, be very productive at it. So,
it's coming up on that time of the year where almost to the point, folks, where bank fishing for these things is preference over boat fishing.
Yeah, it can be. It can be as well. So, get out there and take the family fishing. Get out there and chase some of these things. Many folks just love to eat them. They say they're just the best thing since sliced bread. So get out there and have at it. And it is getting close to that time where they're definitely going to be everywhere on our reservoirs as far as actively feeding. So get out there and do that. Folks, the tip of the week, I've had some questions on setting up the Lowrance HDS screens, and one of the things I'll discuss here briefly, when you're actively searching for fish, deciding which screens you want to view on your electronics HDS units can be critical. My suggestion is using a combination of 3 screens, one for 2D sonar, one for left side structure scan, and one for right side structure scan. You can cover a lot of water with this configuration and find fish producing areas and suspended fish with increased speed and accuracy. So try this setup next time you're on the water, and I'm sure you'll agree with me that this is one of the best setups as far as screen locations and number of screens, especially if you're running the HDS 9 or the HDS 12. It's an excellent combination. Like I always say, remember, if you can't find them, you ain't going to catch them. So that's one of the tips I'll send with you today. Folks, feel free to send me an email if you have a Lowrance question. I'll try to help out. Once again, get out and enjoy one of the many lakes or streams we're blessed to have. Brian, thanks for coming on the show today, and I've hoped we'd help some folks with some catfish questions and thoughts. And folks, get out there and get after these catfish, because we're coming up on the time of year when it's just not going to get any better.
Definitely the prime time.
Don't forget, folks, you can find us on Facebook at Just Fish Outdoors. Folks, get out and enjoy one of the many lakes or streams we're blessed to have. Thanks for listening, and be sure to catch us next week at the same time. This is Dale York, host of Just Fish Outdoors, saying, we'll catch you later.